How you doing, everyone? It's me, Joe Perrone, one of your fellow classmates, and I'm here today to provide you with a case comparison in emergency management and crisis communication between two different United States military operations. The first being called Operation Eagle Claw, the failed rescue attempt of the American hostages in Iran, and the second being Operation Neptune Spear, the successful kill of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. My goal is to show you how the failures of Eagle Claw will lead to success of Operation Neptune Spear. I created a PowerPoint presentation which is basically an overview of what I'm going to be going over, which would better help you go through this video. At the end, there's a video source slide that actually shows you President Carter and President Obama's speech to the nation following each operation, basically their crisis communication plan and how they held and developed the news to the nation. It also has links to other news episodes of each Eagle Claw and Neptune Spear. So let's begin. What I want to do is set that tone for you. We're going to focus on Eagle Claw first and what Eagle Claw is. It essentially was a failed rescue attempt by the United States military to rescue the 53 Iranian hostages. The time frame we're going to focus on in the 4 phases of emergency management is December 1978 to April 1980. And that's where the mitigation phase, the identifying that threat and the risks starts. Iran in the 1970s is starting to see the rise of Islamic fundamentalists led by the exiled Ayatollah Khamenei, who's been in exile for over the last 15 years, now basing his operations out of Paris, France. They're dissatisfied with the current pro-Westernized government led by the Shah, and they're dissatisfied with their reforms, the way the leadership is presenting it, the white revolution, as was in the 60s, that was leading more towards that secular government than what we see today in Turkey. In December of 1978, anti-government protests have begun, and the United States, the State Department, National Security Council, is starting to see these as posing a threat towards Americans living in Iran. And in December 8th and December 9th, the Joint Chiefs of Staff directed Military Airlift Command, MAC, or we know it today as Air Mobility Command, AMC, to fly 2 C-5s and 9 C-141s on special mission assignments to pick up 903 family members that were living in Tehran at the time, who actually wanted to leave. And this is where we start the first phase, the mitigation, the threat, the anti-government personnel. Now, these airlifts would continue on for over the next few months, ending in the end of February. In January of 1979, the Shah flees Iran. And on February 1st, Khamenei returns from exile, claiming victory, and 4 days later establishes his own government, a government that basically transforms Iran into that theoretical ruled Islamic State, basically changing all the domestic views and pushes of the government, completely abandoning the Shah's pro-Western orientation and adopting a foreign policy of hostility towards both the United States and the Soviet Union. On February 8th, between December 9th and February 10th, the United States launched over 35 C-5s and 87 C-141s and recovered over 5,800 personnel out of Tehran. It was good, though, because on February 10th, the Iranians closed the airport, Mirabab Airport, forcing a suspension of these airlift operations temporarily. But one thing came out 4 days later on the 14th. The beginning of hostilities, true hostilities towards the Americans, kicked off when Iranians stormed the embassy for the first time. Stormed the embassy, took it over, and picked up 100 Americans as hostages. It wasn't until Khamenei's security forces stepped in with Americans' request that this was put down, basically giving the American embassy back to them. More airlift operations continued, and as of March 1st, the United States decided to leave a skeletal staff at the embassy, a total of 53 people. So basically, though, between March and November, hostilities continued, protests continued on a daily basis, and stuff like death to Carter, burning Carter image dolls was a common thing against the U.S. Embassy, basically against an anti-pro-Western regime. It wasn't until the Shah was diagnosed with cancer that it really hit the tipping point. When he requested medical treatment in the United States, which President Carter granted, even after his advisors ruled against it, that the Iranians were basically fed up with the way the United States government was acting towards them. And on November 4th, 1979, they stormed the embassy and took 53 personnel hostage. Now, we are going to enter our prepared stage of Eagle Claw. And now, how do we basically pull everybody out? You can basically look at, we've been preparing to mitigate this threat since the beginning of the airlifts, which I would agree with you. But now it's how to free those individuals. So we shifted now to our response phase. We're kind of dual hatting that prepared and response phase. How are we going to thwart this threat, and how are we going to jump in and save our hostages from a hostile Iranian government? National Security Council offered a couple of different options for President Carter, a few being seizure of airfields, seizure of oil fields, retaliatory bombings, mining of harbor, total blockade of Strait of Hormuz, basically trying to attempt to isolate the Iranians from the world. In a surprise, the president goes with a rescue attempt. A rescue attempt pretty much basically that, in my own personal opinion, after reading all the reports, has seen it was a failure from the beginning. The United States lacked a few key things that today we take advantage of, one being air bases in the region. We didn't have Ali Salim or Al Dhafar or Al Udeid like we do now in the Persian Gulf. There wasn't any back then. The United States was basing off of airfields from other countries. There was no strong American presence in the Gulf. Second being, intelligence sources in Iran has basically disappeared once the revolution started. Human was at an all-time low. So they really didn't know what was going on in the country itself, what was happening deep in Tehran. Of course, the other collection intelligence sources were there, imagery, electronics, but nothing on the ground, what was actually happening. So the Joint Chiefs puts together a operation considered Eagle Claw, which takes 6 months of preparation. It involved all services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and the CIA to prepare for this mission. The complement would involve 3 MC-130s, which primary mission was to insert the ground forces, 3 EC-130s, which was focused on helicopter refueling, 8 RH-53 helicopters from the USS Nimitz, and 1 C-141 cargo airlift aircraft. They were all to meet up except the C-141 at Desert 1, which is a predetermined location 200 miles southeast of Tehran for the first link-up phase. And then after that, the second link-up would move them closer to Desert 2, just the 53s. The MC-130s would depart off an island in Oman and move forward with the assault force to Desert 1. This would kick off on April 24th. Once they are in the air, the EC-130s would follow suit, followed by the 53s off the Nimitz. 8 to make 6, 6 being the operational minimum required to carry out the mission itself. So, it's April 24th. It's a go. The MC-130s take off. The EC-130s take off. The first one lands on the ground. The ground assault team leads out. But unbeknownst to them, there is the beautiful highway that is next to it, and a tanker bus, actually, that is actually coming down that road. The ground force stops the bus and seizes close to 45 Iranian civilians off that bus. Now they have what you consider prisoners at this time, and what to do with them. Can't release them, so they are holding them apprehended at this point on one of the 130s. The airfield for Desert 1 was already pre-set up in the planning process by the CIA, who came in, set up the covert landing lights and the field itself, their mission was to pick up translators, Mercedes-Benz trucks that will be able to move them from Desert 2 from Tehran from Desert 2 to Tehran to rescue the hostages. The 53s would in turn fly in, pick up the ground assault force with the hostages, and bring them back to Desert, to another predetermined airfield, where the C-141 would come in and pick everyone up. That was the plan. So now we're back at Desert 1. The MC-130s are there with the hostages, with now the Iranian prisoners. A tractor-trailer tanker now comes down that same exact road, and they fire a anti-tank missile at it, destroying the tanker, setting it ablaze, which actually became a large landing signal for the additional 130s to see and land in, which turned out to be actually helpful for them. All the 130s are on the ground. At the time when the 53s launched, the 8 are en route. Well, one of the failed mission planning considerations was weather, which we'll later get to it while they're en route. Immediately after flight, one of the 53s has a rotor blade malfunction, a failure light come on, which causes an immediate landing. Determined that cannot be fixed, and that 53 is abandoned. The crew jumps on the one of the secondary flying ones that are in the formation. They continue on now 6 out of 7 to make 6 we're looking at here. Now this is when weather kicks in. Weather kicks in, heavy fog, bringing in dense dust throughout on their flight path. They spread out to avoid collision amongst each other because they are not within visual range of each other. It's too dense to see each other. Instrument flying only. They would continue on with their formation until one of the 53s receives a navigation malfunction. The aircraft commander finds it to be a unsafe environment and returns to the Nemitz. Now you are down to 6 aircraft. The loss of another 53 will have a termination of the entire mission set. An hour and a half to 2 hours off schedule from when they were supposed to arrive at Desert 1, the 53s finally land. But those EC-130s are burning fuel sitting out there, unnecessary fuel that they need to leave. So as they come on the ground and land, one of the 53s experience a hydraulic failure. Now that hydraulic failure will cause that aircraft, it's not repairable, to be abandoned there. The 53s are now down to 5. This mission is a no-go at this point. The commander is on the ground, calls back, who the President Carter is involved in the chain of command at this time for the operation, and is briefed on the situation, who makes the call that this is a no-go, index, as we like to call it, for this operation. So now we have to recover the forces from Desert 1. We haven't even got to Desert 2, nor refuel the helicopters yet. So in the refueling process of those helicopters to leave Desert 1, one of the 53s, after completing its recovery, after completing the fuel, picked up and started moving. As it was turning, its rotor blade struck one of the EC-130s, and the resulting explosion destroyed both of the aircraft and endangered the other ones. Unfortunately, 8 servicemen were killed during this blaze. Both aircraft were completely destroyed. Another hard add to the already failure of the exercise due to equipment malfunction. Now you have 8 service members who were unfortunately died in the explosions. The remaining individuals decided to abandon the 53s in place, all boarded the 130s, and departed back to Oman in order to offload. This was already briefed back to President Carter, who on the next day addressed the nation, April 25th, of the failures of the Operation Eagle Claw and what was submitted to the nation. His address is one of the links that I was mentioning to you. It goes into depth of how he saw this as a humanitarian mission that had very little negative threat directed at the Iranian people or the Iranian government. No hostilities and no Iranian casualties. Yes, they did take those Iranians with them and left them and turned them over to Egypt, where they were not harmed. And President Carter, towards the end, from that point on, from April 25th to the end of his presidency, worked on freeing the Iranian hostages. Basically, this sealed his failure of re-election. because following the inauguration of President Reagan, a few hours later, the Iranians released the American hostages. But following the event, Admiral James Holloway was put in charge to investigate the scenario itself and figure out what actually went wrong. We call this the Holloway Report, which produced a Special Operations Review Group. And it focused on poor mission planning, poor command and control due to poor inter-service operability. Which now leads us to the Goldwater-Nichols Act. Well, this Goldwater-Nichols Act is kind of that formation of what we want to talk about. It shifted and changed the way we see our military now. It was legislation signed by President Reagan in 1986, and it aimed at removing those inter-service rivalries and forcing a joint environment. It reorganized the Department of Defense, turning the Joint Chief into an advisor, not as an actual head of the chain of command. Set up the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and gave the power to the unified commanders or the combatant commanders and established one chain of command, where in the past each service component worked in a unified environment, but that environment wasn't truly joint. The service component was in charge of their aircraft. It led to the future establishment of U.S. Special Operations Command, and then for me, doing time in Air Force Special Operations Command, or AVSOC, seeing the final product being completed in the operational sense for it, which led to now one straight chain of command where the components were under one 3 or 4 star general. So now we fast forward all the way to 2011. We're involved in the war in Afghanistan. I myself, 2 tours at this time, 2007, and Kandahar in 2009 in Bagram. Did actually spend some time in Jaybad or Jalalabad. We are given Operation Neptune Spear, the war against the Taliban and Al Qaeda, holding and the Al Qaeda terrorist group which caused 9/11. We figure out through our intelligence collection capability, which has advanced way more than what we saw in 2000 and what we saw in 1979 and 1980, to identify the location of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, deep inside the Pakistani border. With having the ability of the U.S. Special Operations Command, they were able to train as one unified command, one aviation command, one 160th SOAR, train one set of fighting, one ability to hone in on those skills to achieve proper command and control, proper mission planning, and inter-service operability amongst air, ground, and ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, in order to achieve a successful mission. Yes, we did lose an aircraft, but that was out of operational capability due to malfunction, not based on an error or based on weather. Weather was a key component in the mission planning process, a go-no-go criteria for the event itself. And you could see how the limitations of the way the Operation Eagle Claw functioned versus the way Operation Neptune Spear functioned. You could see that change, how that broadcasted itself to kind of incorporate everything into one successful mission set for Operation Neptune Spear. The failures of one did lead to the successes of the other. Congress had to step in order to achieve that. The services weren't unable to do it. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the portion of the box. And I hope that you have a greater understanding of Operation Eagle Claw tied into the successes of Operation Neptune Sphere. And it was really good to work with you all. And good luck with everything else.